Good morning, Genealogy Collective. I'm so sorry that I cannot be there with you in person. Unfortunately, I had another commitment, but I'm delighted at the opportunity of being able to provide this presentation for you, even if it is recorded. Of course, at the very end, in your handout, there's going to be my contact information. So if you have any questions for me, please, by all means, feel free to send me an email. My company is Tamarack Genealogy, and our contact information is on our website at www.tamarackgenealogy, Tamarack, genealogy.com. So I'm truly excited to talk to you today about archives. That is what my specialty is in. A little bit about me. I am the owner of Tamarack Genealogy, but I am also a local history librarian and archivist. So my master's degree is in archives and preservation. So that is the topic that I geek out over at any opportunity that when I have that chance. So I am going to turn my camera off so that you can see my full screen during the presentation. And again, thank you for having me. I look forward to seeing you in person in the spring, and enjoy. So what types of archives are out there? Believe it or not, there are nearly half a dozen different types. Most of us have a tendency to think about federal and state archives. That's where we're going to go when we need military records or probates or naturalizations. But there are a whole host of additional types of archives. We have things like corporate archives, which I'm going to talk about, digital archives and resources, federal, as I mentioned, museum and society archives, religious archives, and then university archives. So what does that mean? It means that those that are open to the public, those that contain public records like state and municipal archives, are typically open and available for you to visit. What about those that are private archives, things like religious archives, corporate archives, sometimes university archives? Those can be a little bit different, and I'm going to talk about the different steps and the different procedures that you can follow in order to make sure that your visit meets your needs and your goals. So archives collect a wide range of formats. So that includes things from ephemera, 3D objects like military uniforms, maybe furniture, to things like audio-video recordings. That could be oral histories, that could be feature films, that can be sound recordings in a variety of formats. Images and paper documents, textual documents we're familiar with. Those are those things like letters and diaries, photographs, posters, things like newspapers and periodicals. Those would fall under the images and the paper collections. Not only do archives collect things about the outside world, but they also collect things about their organization as well. So if we're talking about museums, historical societies, genealogical societies, not only would they have things on the community and on families and on topics of interest that had impacted them in their community, but it would also be things that would relate specifically to how the organization is managed and run as well. So that usually would include, a list of board members, that would usually include incorporation papers, that might include yearly elections or lists of volunteers. So there's lots of different types of things that you can get out of an archives collection. So keep that in mind when you're starting to think about, well, what types of documents could this institution have? Or what types of documents could this institution have available for me to look at? And there's a difference between what they have and what they have available. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. So you may have heard the term archives and archive. What does that mean? So basically an archives is anything that has a physical collection. So if I'm going to drive to my county courthouse and I'm going to ask to take a look at their probate records, those would be in archives. Archive are things that are strictly digital or media collections. So Internet Archive, for example, would be an example. And that would also include things that are strictly born digital, which means that there's never been a paper copy. So things like emails, things like art, digital art that are created, those are archive materials. And I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of that in just a second. So some terminology that you want to be familiar with before you head to the archives are kind of how the structure is designed. So things like record groups. So that is the hierarchy of materials. That is the collection. That is the overarching topic that would be covered. So for example, health, military, school. And then within that, you have record series or file groups. So that would be something like military is the record group, World War I would be the record series, and then the file group might be Army, Navy, Marine Corps. Or it could be something like health records, and then the record series would be tuberculosis, hospitals, and then the file group could be each of the individual hospitals within that tuberculosis hospital system. Arrangement is, how is it put together? Is it organized alphabetical by surname? Is it chronological by date? Is it numerical by military unit? And then how is it arranged within those subjects? How many boxes are there? So is it, if it's alphabetical by surname, how many boxes of surnames are there? Is it one per letter of the alphabet? Are there multiple together at once? So box and file folder under arrangement. So let's give you another example. So I work at a public library. You've probably all visited your public library. If you're logging on and watching this, you're probably there right now. So the record group could be cooking. And if I want to be technical, the subject heading for cooking is actually cookery, but nobody really talks that way anymore. So cooking would be the record group. And then within that record group, the series or the file groups would be grilling, baking, healthy eating, desserts. Those would be the series or the file groups within it. And then how is that arranged? Typically, it's arranged by Dewey number. So that would be numerical, and then alphabetical by the surname. So that would be the arrangement. A finding aid is, how do I dig in? How do I find out what is it within the collection? How do I understand what's available to me? So the finding aid would be like the library catalog. So for example, finding aids can be databases. So an every name search database, like something that the New York State Archives has. It could be something like a Word document that just spells out, here are the collections we have, and here's loose box and file folder numbers for what's within it. It could be something like an Excel spreadsheet. It could be something that's just handwritten that says, these are the records that we have for, I live in Will County, these are the records we have for Will County probates, and these are the either the box numbers or these are the volume numbers, and that can be handwritten. So finding it is really anything that helps you understand what is within the collection and how you can access it. So some prep work you want to do before you have your feet on site. You want to find out and address what the hours of operation are. Do they have holiday closures coming up? We do have Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. How many locations does the facility have? Are they all in one building, or are you going to have to travel from one site to another? Are these documents accessible to the public? We're going to talk more about that in just a second. What are the scope and coverage? Meaning, does it have the years that I need for the topic that I'm interested in? Does it have marriage certificates from 1792? Does it have probate files from 1836? What's the turnaround time? How long will it take for me to walk out with the documents that I need? And then, am I allowed to use my own electronic devices? That would include things like cameras, scanners, handheld devices. So let's delve into that a little bit deeper. So I'm in the Chicagoland area. So Chicago Public Library has several locations, several branches, and within a couple of those branches, they have their own archives. So the Harold Washington Library has the City of Chicago Municipal Archives, but then they also have various other archives scattered around. So they're not all in one location. For example, Cook County municipal records, probates, marriages, deaths would be in separate buildings. So the clerk's office would have births, marriages, and deaths. That's in one building. Circuit court records, which would be probate, criminal investigations, family court, those would be in another building. So keep in mind, how many different buildings, how many different places am I going to have to go? And are they on the same complex? Meaning, can I park in one location and walk to each of the buildings, or am I going to have to drive and pay potentially parking fees, gas mileage to go to more than one location? Library of Congress is a good example. They're on one campus, but they have 3 different buildings that you can walk between. And then something like the National Archives, which has over 50 locations and over 7 regional archives scattered across the country. So take a look at the websites, see how many locations they have, see how close they are, what are the proximities, and then start thinking about hours. Do they have the same collection hours? So if I need births, marriages, and deaths, are they open until 4 or 4:30, or do they close early? What time does the probate office close? What time does the recorder of deeds office close? Do they have the same hours? And then do they have the same pull times? So for example, if I needed to get a land record, what's the latest time of the day that I would be able to request that record and still view it the same day? So always make sure, if you're dealing with separate locations and if you're dealing with separate collections, what are their hours, where are their locations, and what are their availability times? When can I come in and take a look at records? How about things like parking lots and fees? Is there an attendant on duty? Do I have to have exact change? Do I have to have change for lockers, or can I pay by credit card for these types of things? A really good example of that would be the New York State Archives. They've got a page set up for before you visit that kind of explains where the closest lot is, use the Madison lot, and things like how far is a walk of it? How far of a walk is it from the parking lot to the building? How safe is it? Is it in a good location? All of those are kind of things that you need to consider as well. What can I bring with me? I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But, do I have to have a locker to put my coat and my umbrella and my bag in, or is it something that I can bring in with me? Scope and coverage are probably 2 of the most important things that you're going to ask of yourself and of the collection. So county boundaries change, state boundaries change, city boundaries change. Do they physically have the objects that I need for the time period that I'm researching? So for example, here in Illinois, the county boundaries kind of ebbed and flowed and changed up until the time of the Civil War. So by 1860, they were pretty set, but we did have a couple that kind of shimmied back and forth a little bit until about 1865. So if I need records from where I live currently right now, that was originally Virginia. If you go back historically to colonial times, it was southern Wisconsin at one point. It was Putnam County in Illinois. Then it became Cook County in Illinois before it split off into Will County in 1836. So having a general idea of where your family lived and at what time periods they were in that particular location can help you make sure you're looking in the right place. So if I'm looking for my family pre-1836, I'm looking in Cook County or Putnam County. If I'm looking for records post-1836, then I'm looking in Will County. So would that archives have the records that I need for the period in which I need it? And then what is the coverage? Is anything missing? Were records accidentally destroyed in a courthouse fire or some other natural disaster? Are there records missing because of not just environmental factors, but man-made factors? Things like the Great Chicago Fire destroyed a huge number of records pre-1871 because the fire ripped through downtown Chicago. But then think about records that might be destroyed because of flooding, like Johnstown flood, records from that community, or people who are impacted by war, like records that may have been destroyed during the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. So is there a gap in coverage? And then what records are specifically affected? For example, here in Will County, we have coroner's inquest records that go back to 1865, but volume 2 is missing. Nobody has any idea what happened to it, but the coroner's inquest records from 1868 to 1871 are just missing. The volume is just not there, and nobody knows what happened to it. So that would be an example of a gap in coverage in the specific records that are affected. Think about turnaround time. Sometimes you're not allowed to walk out the door with what you need at that time because maybe that particular collection is stored off-site, or maybe it's the last pull time of the day and you have to wait until the following morning to have access, or just because You're not allowed to make your own copies. Maybe the office facilities manager is responsible for making copies, and you have to go into the queue and wait until your records are available. And this is not uncommon that you would not walk out the door with the materials that you've requested. To give you a couple of examples, here in my state of Illinois, if I need to go to Cook County Circuit Court Archives and I need a probate record, those are stored offsite. So I can go into the facility, I could put in my request for the probate record. Usually takes them about a week or two. They call and say, okay, those probates are here. You can come take a look at them. And then I can walk out the door that day with those copies, but I cannot view those copies at that time. The flip side to that would be in Kendall County, where I could go and I can look through the volumes and I can mark the pages that I would like copied, but I can't walk out the door with those copies. I have to wait for them to make the photocopies and then come back. So sometimes you just won't be able to leave the facility with those documents. But that's when you ask if electronic devices are allowed. And you can do that in advance or the day that you arrive. Some that are in courthouses will not allow cameras in the building, so you wouldn't be able to make photocopies of those documents. But in a lot of other types of archives, typically you would be able to bring your equipment. Federal Archives is an example. I can bring my cameras, I can bring my scanner, I can make my copies, and there's no charge. Some facilities will say, absolutely, you can use your own device, but then always ask, is it the same fee if I make a photo copy of it versus having you make a copy of it? Sometimes they'll say, yes, every photo you take would be the same cost as a photocopy. And that's more than acceptable as long as I can get a nice, good, clear image. The cost is negligent to the conversation. So ask up front, am I allowed to bring my own devices? What types of devices are allowed or not allowed? And what would the cost be for me using my own device? So let's talk about some specific types of archives and collections that are out there. We have a tendency in genealogy to overlook the huge range of materials that are available in academic archives and special collections. And we kind of do ourselves a disservice when we do that. So archives and special collections are not the same thing. So University Archives manages the documents and the records created by the school. So that would be student records, employee records, facilities management records, maps and illustrations of the building process for the campus. That would include things like yearbooks, school newspapers, professors' papers, directories. And then there are what are called special collections. So those are unique collections that are built to support and highlight a particular field of study. So that could be something like 17th century women's diaries. That could be things like marketing and advertising. That could be things like circus and allied arts, a couple fun ones, witchcraft, business collections. So those are how those kind of break down. So someplace like Stanford, I'm going to talk about Cornell in just a second, have some really amazing, not only university archives, but special collections as well. And what's important to remember about academic archives is that these aren't born in a vacuum. So yes, they're collecting records related to the campus and its students and its faculty and its staff, but they also are within a community. So a lot of times academic archives will have things like maps, things that are local history in thought and in origin. So things like phone books, city directories, county histories, where they're not just talking about their students, they're talking about the community at large as well. So sometimes looking at academic archives in special collections for a university or a community college that's within the area where you're doing your family history might give you some really nice, pleasant surprises about some things that they have that includes your family, just simply because the family lived close to the university. So those things like newspapers, those things like city directories, phone books could be really, really advantageous to your research. And a lot of academic libraries and special collections will have that. Cornell University is probably one of my favorites. And pre-COVID, they used to lend certain things out of their special collections through interlibrary loan. I don't know if COVID killed that. Maybe somebody can let me know as you're watching this. But they have some really fascinating things. So not only things about the university and their students, but they have things like an anti-slavery collection. They have a history of hip hop collection, Icelandic records. They have an Icelandic collection, but probably the coolest one that I've come across, and luckily they have some digital collections of this up online, but they have a collection of witchcraft. And it's I want to say global, but it's mostly Europe, in the US, North America, but they have some of the original court transcripts from some of these witchcraft cases during the colonial era. They're absolutely fascinating. So university collections are really, really important, and I highly recommend you use them. Another one would be Harvard's collection of 18th and 17th century women's diaries. So these diaries cross, the United States, and they tell the history of the women's movement. They tell the history of life and society, one woman at a time. And what's important about this collection is it's not just the Northeast. It's not just the 13 colonies. It's not just Massachusetts or Connecticut or a specific geographic region. It's all over. They want to be able to tell the story of women's lives during this time period. So they have diaries from all over the US. And it's very, very possible that your family could be represented in this collection. So don't think that a university that's nowhere near you isn't going to have any pertinent information, because a lot of times their special collections will collect in a topic, and that's not just regional, that's global. Another example would be the Vaudeville Archives at the University of Arizona. Illinois State University, go Redbirds, also has a Vaudeville and Allied Arts collection. And these are collections that include not just circuses, but circus, vaudeville, any type of staged production. So that could be small traveling troops, that could be things like Barnum and Bailey, but they include these types of materials, and they're not just Arizona vaudeville acts. They're not just Illinois circuses. They're really national. So looking at these special collections would really, really help you. And you might say, well, how on earth would I ever even know that this archive existed, or that this collection could be relevant to me? I'm going to talk about that in just a second when I talk about digital archives. I talk about corporate archives first, and corporate archives could be tremendously important to your research because, you might have had an employee that worked for that particular company, or, something like railroads, which are corporations but have a much larger national scope. They're going to include things like personnel records, company newsletters and magazines and publications. They're going to have things like patents and research and development files and designs, lots and lots and lots of photographs, whether that's of their buildings, their factories, their facilities, personnel, meaning events like a company picnic that they might have had annually, and they've got photos from those individual events. So corporate archives have a lot of photos in them, but there are other things within those records that could be very, very useful to you. So something like the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, they have their own archives in Atchison, Kansas, that you would be able to, I take that back. It's not Atchison, Kansas, it's in Topeka, Kansas, where you would be able to reach out to them and contact them and ask them for information about personnel records. Or something like the Pullman Company, which is based in Chicago. Their personnel files are actually split. The Pullman Porters, those records are at the Newberry Library in Chicago. The builders who built the train cars, those records are at South Suburban Genealogical Society in Hazel Crest. So those actual personnel records, where it gives their date of employment, a photograph, a brief description of what their job description was, and date of leave, if they left, if they retired, if they were fired, would all be documented on there. But there's a lot of companies that had newsletters and magazines as well. So my grandfather worked for Campbell Soup Company, and Campbell Soup had its own magazine that it put out, where not only was it talking about the things that the company was doing and, here's our growth and expansion, there was a lot of information about employees. So for example, here's my grandpa Larry on the left. He was a ham radio operator. And just before he retired, Campbell's had this strict enforced policy that as soon as you turned 65, you retired. That was it. You didn't get to go to 65 in 3 days. Like the day after your 65th birthday, you were done. So in 1952, about a month before my grandpa was, I hate to say forced, but forced into retirement, they did a full page article about him. They came to the house, they took a photo of him at his ham radio, and it's a little article about him working for the company, us living at on 38th Street, and just information about him. Here's another example. This one's from the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, and you can see the information, September birthdays. Here are the people who work for the company who are celebrating this month. You'll find a lot of things like birth announcements, graduation announcements, as well as corporate things like retirements and promotions. But you'll see things, there's a column in the Santa Fe employee news paper or the magazine that would have things like, little engineers, and it would be all the births that took place that previous month. Really kind of some fun stuff that comes out of these. Corporate archives are private entities unless you're lucky enough that they've been turned over to a larger institution like a university archives or a municipal archives. So corporate archives, because they're private, aren't always necessarily open to the public. You can't just show up at John Deere Archives. You would have to make an appointment, or you would have to reach out and contact them in advance and tell them what it is you're looking for. A lot of them are usually pretty responsive within a day or two to say, yes, we have that, or no, we don't. A lot of times they will charge fees because they are a for-profit company. But this is just a small example of kind of the type and the scope of records that exist out there. So for example, I'm lucky enough that the Carnegie archives were already turned over to Columbia University. So I can view a large portion of those records already through their digital archive that's online. But for some place like Kodak, yes, Kodak has some things online, but I would want to reach out to them. Or Pan Am, which no longer exists, but they still have an archives for their corporate records and files. I can reach out to them. Wells Fargo is another one, just as an example. But in your handout, there's the corporate archives list to kind of give you an idea of the types of corporate archives that are out there. And it usually has their contact information there. So you could reach out, whether it's Dell or whether it's someplace like State Farm Insurance, you would be able to reach out to them for more information. So what are those digital archives that I was talking about? A lot of times they are those materials that are strictly born digital. So those are things like emails, like I said, digital art, things where there's not a physical copy. Yes, you can print a physical copy of an email, but it's not already in that format. So that's what born digital means. That would be things like media archives. So that would be things like sound recordings, documentaries, feature films, movies of some kind where you don't have a textual paper document from which to work from. But then there's digital archives where they are taking that original paper textual document and they are digitizing it to make it available to a larger audience. So those would be things like newspaper collections, like Newspaper Archive. Those would be things like Internet Archive, where they're scanning millions of books both within and outside of copyright and making them available digitally as well. Photograph collections that are available online. A good example of a digital archives would be DPLA, which is the Digital Public Library of America. That includes things like New York Public Library's digital collections. Here in Illinois, that includes the Illinois Digital Archives, which is all rolled up into DPLA as well. So DPLA acts as a portal for all of these smaller collections so that they could get viewed by a larger audience instead of me knowing that I have to go to New York Public Library or Ida, Illinois. I can find it, I can discover it through a larger source like DPLA or Internet Archive. Like I had mentioned, what if I didn't know? You don't know what you don't know. So how would I even know that there was an archives collection out there for allied arts or for the circus or for witchcraft? How would I even know that? The best place to start is through ArchiveGrid. So for example, in public libraries, we have access to WorldCat, which is the World Catalog. I don't have a book in my library, but I really want to read it. World Catalog will go out and look for a library that owns it, and then I can request it and have it sent to me. So that could be a university library. That could be another public library, and I can request that and have it sent to me. So for example, 3 out of 4 branches of my family come from the Albany, New York area. So I put in a request for an 1846 Albany City Directory. And it came to me from one of the university libraries that had it on their shelf. Didn't matter what the age was. They're not an archives, they're a research institution. So you're probably not going to get materials from historical collections, genealogical collections. They're probably not going to send. So usually I'll avoid requesting from state libraries, but some do send. The Kansas State Library lends, the Wisconsin State Library, Wisconsin Historical Society lends. But typically for interlibrary loan, I'm looking at public libraries or university libraries. ArchiveGrid is the same thing. It's built by the same company, only it deals with loose manuscripts and document collections versus bound published volumes. Now, these are not things that are available through interlibrary loan. I cannot find something in this collection and request it, but at least it tells me where it is and what's included in it. So I don't give you a screenshot of it, but I want you to just go and play around with it if and when you have the opportunity, because your family could easily be represented in an ArchiveGrid collection that you didn't even know existed. So let's say they had a cousin who lived in another state and they wrote letters back and forth to each other over a 20 or 30-year period. Somebody in that family could have donated them to their historical society, their university library collection, the state library or historical society or archives, and somebody put together a finding aid of letters and diaries, 18th century women's diaries, Civil War letters, and your family might be represented in those. So sometimes just browsing by surname, by location, by topic to see who has something on the Atchison Topeka Railway, who has something on Masonic lodges in North Carolina. And it's going to do those searches for me and show me those collections. There's a smattering of original digital images you would find online, but the vast majority of it is just a database, a collections portal of here's who has what, and here's how you can contact them for more information. ArchiveGrid is a huge time saver and a lifeline in a lot of regards for helping me find those collections that I didn't even know existed, but are super important to my genealogical and historical research. Other types of digital archives and repositories out there, things like you'll see the New York Public Library in a couple more slides. Boston Public Library is a great example. Media Burn, which is based in Chicago, but is films and documentaries. They've got a collection of that born digital material already there. And then if you just want to know more, if you just want to kind of try to wrap your head around what types of digital archives are out there, there's this website out there that's called Digital Killer Libraries and Archives. It is so much fun, but it gives you an idea of the types of collections that exist out there in the US and how you can utilize them. So that's a link where you could go to browse just to kind of get ideas on what should you be looking for? What kind of questions should you be asking yourself? So now let's talk about federal archives and repositories. These are probably the things that we're most familiar with, that and state archives. So federal archives are going to collect things that deal with nations' citizenry. So yes, I'm going to focus on US, but this would be true of Canada. This would be true of France or Scotland or Germany or Russia, wherever you're doing your research. They're interested in the permanent records dealing with national governance and citizenry. So that's going to be things like Defense, Department of Defense, so military enlistments and detachments and things like that. That's going to be things like land sales. So for us, the Bureau of Land Management, you know, the first time land is opened up for sale to the nation's citizenry, they're keeping records on that. That would include things like criminal records, FBI records, RICO records, immigration and naturalization. That would include things like drug trafficking and racketeering, trademark infringement. All of that falls under federal archives and repositories. And believe it or not, bankruptcies are federal. So if you file for bankruptcy, that's a federal court that hears that bankruptcy claim. So these types of records would be found in federal archives and repositories. So they have what are called records retention schedules. So the National Archives does not receive every record, every piece of paper that the federal government produces. Those records are kept under what's called a records retention schedule, which is anywhere usually from 7 to 10 to 15 years. At that time, once they've met that limitation, then those records are reviewed for whether or not they should be saved permanently and added to the archive's permanent record. A lot of things are sampled where they don't take 100% of those records. They might take 10 or 15% of those records, and then the rest are destroyed. So that would be things like Secretary of State would be a good example. So the Secretary of State deems that passports and visa records are permanent and they should be kept for everybody. But then there are other records like the day-to-day maintenance, like staffing hires and day-to-day paperwork, memos about internal State Department policies at embassies might not be needed to be kept permanently. So those would be kept for 7 to 10 to 15 years, or employment records might be kept for 25 years. And then after that time, those records are eligible for destruction. So not everything in the Federal Archives system, in the records retention system, gets kept permanently. So the National Archives has 3 main hubs. They have Archives 1 in Washington, D.C., they have Archives 2, which is in College Park, Maryland, and they have the National Personal Records Center, which is in St. Louis, Missouri. Then they have a series of regional campuses. So those are going to include things that would represent a particular set of states and territories. So for example, the New York campus, the regional campus is at One Bowling Green. So that includes records for New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Where I am in Illinois, in Chicago, we have another one of those regional campus facilities, and we keep records for 7 states. So we have Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa are records that we have in our facility. Georgia would include things in Atlanta, which would include things for Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas, and Florida. So each facility is responsible for a particular area of the country. And they would collect those records that they deemed to be permanent records. So that would be things like immigration and naturalization records. That would be things like Bureau of Land Management records and files and the sort. Now, the National Archives 1 and Archives 2 in College Park, this is where you're going to go for military records. So National Archives 1 would have things like military records from the colonial wars all the way up to 1914. They would have things like homestead applications, land bounty warrants, and things like that. Those are at Archives 1. Archives 2 and NPRC have modern records. So NPRC has records for those military records from 1914 to the present. So World War I is kind of the cutoff. So pre-World War I, those records are in DC. World War I, post-World War I are at NPRC in St. Louis. Now, St. Louis collects personnel files. So if I wanted to know more about my Angus MacDonald, who served in the First World War, his personal file would be in St. Louis. But if I wanted to know more about Angus's unit, he was in the 6th CAC, which is the Coastal Artillery Corps. He was sent overseas to France during the war and returned. His unit records about, his company and his unit, those are at College Park, Maryland. So College Park, Maryland has modern military records pertaining to units, hospitals, transport for 1st, 2nd, Korea, Vietnam going forward. Now, NPRC has some other files that might be of interest to you as well, and those would be those employment records for the federal government. So if somebody was a postmaster, if they worked for the National Park Service as a ranger, if they somehow worked in a federal position, then those records should be available to you through the NPRC in St. Louis. So if you had somebody who was a census taker, those records should be on file at NPRC. Another set of collections that they have would be if somebody was a civilian employee working in a military type job. So for example, my grandma Jean worked as a secretary for Army purchasing during the Second World War at Navy Pier in Chicago. her personnel record was there. So I could see what her typing scores were and what vacation days she had requested and when she had finally left her employment in order to start a family. All of that was documented in her personnel file. So I was able to get a copy of that from St. Louis. Now in New York, you've got a lot of records available to you as well. So they've got naturalization records, they've got Civil War provost marshal records. So those are, the provost marshal was the person who was responsible for procurement and disbursement. So uniforms, tack, blankets, horses, those are the kind of records that the provost marshal would have for each unit. So if you had somebody from New Jersey or from New York who had served in the Civil War, they're going to show up by unit in those provost marshal records. They do have court records as well. So those things like bankruptcies, like I said, which are criminal federal charges, those were all moved recently during COVID from New York to Kansas City. So now Kansas City is the repository nationwide for bankruptcies and for some criminal and civil case records. So if you go to the archives website, it says in bold letters right on the front page, these record collections are no longer here. They have been moved, but there are still plenty of criminal case files for the New York area that are still on file there. So again, those things like copyright infringements, trademark infringements, some of those FBI type records, those criminal mob type records, some of those are still in New York. But definitely take a look at that link on the webpage to see exactly what's been moved, to again, make sure that they have the records specifically that you're looking for, that they're still on site in New York City. And that link is available for you here. Again, a Google search would get you right to that location. But they do have a research room. It had been closed because of COVID. Obviously, almost all of the archives facilities have reopened, but there still are a few here and there. New York was one, Chicago was one, and San Francisco was one that had remained closed, that did not reopen when the National Archives reopened. So definitely make sure you're taking a look at the website to see if they're open and potentially book an appointment. Some of them even have Facebook pages that are kind of giving you more up-to-date information than the website. So take a look at the Facebook page that they have specifically for New York to see what the hours are and the dates that they're open. So federal records, like I said, can include land records. They would include things like census schedules, military records, and the like. So when you look at the 1950 census, which unfortunately is not complete for us in Illinois or for you in New York, I can still browse the National Archives website and look at the census page by page by page, even if the every name index for 1950 is not complete yet. But a census is a federal record. So those are the types of things that the National Archives facilities would have. Things like military records, like I described a little bit ago, personnel files about First and Second World War, Korean War soldiers are at St. Louis. But those records collections, like the photograph collections, those are in College Park. So College Park houses the photograph collections, the map collections, and the audiovisual collections for the National Archives. So if I want to look at photos from the First or Second World War, if I want to look at maps from the Revolutionary War or from Korea, those are all in College Park, Maryland. And the facility is open and you can get a researcher card and you can walk in the door. Like I said, land records. So here's a homestead application. This particular collection of records are available through Archives One in DC. They are open. You are able to get a research card and walk in the door and view these records in person. So let's walk through the site. How do I find it? I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about how the archive site works so that when you go looking for your family members or for record collections, you have an idea of where to go. So here's the screenshot from the homepage of the National Archives, which is archives.gov. You'll notice in the top left corner, you can research their records, or you can specifically request veterans records. They've got teacher resources, which have some really great digital images and recordings, sound recordings and videos to use in your research. You want to know more about what locations and what types of documents they have, you can click on that as well. And there are collections, you can order things directly online through them. So I can buy a copy of a land record, I can buy a copy of a naturalization directly through the archives website. I can pay for that and they'll mail me a copy in the mail. So if we click on that top link and we want to research their records, it's going to take us to a page that looks like this, where I can research my ancestry. So I can click in that circle and browse the types of records they have available to genealogists. That is repeated at the bottom of the page. So instead of getting a nice little graphic to click on, it just says, oh, you're a genealogist or you're a military historian, click here for more records. And either of those are going to delve you deeper into those particular collections. So it's worth it to go into the archive site and just browse through these categories to kind of get a feel for the types of records fall under the federal scope. I can browse the online catalog, so I can put in a simple keyword search and see everything that they have. If I want to purchase a copy of a record, I can do that through this page too. I can learn more about researching in person at the individual facilities, or I can view their microfilm catalog. Think of things like censuses, those are on microfilm. Military records, those are on microfilm. Things like city directories, those are on microfilm. And I can get an inventory of what exists through the archive system and see what may be available to purchase. You can buy individual reels of microfilm from the federal government, and it would give you those details as well. The AAD is something that might be useful to you if you're looking for modern records. So these are not born digital collections. These are things where they've taken textual records and they've built a database around them. And they have it broken down by time period and by military engagement. So for example, in the AAD, they would have an index to Army enlistments during the Second World War. So if I suspect somebody might have served, but I'm not 100% sure, I can go into the AAD and search by name. So I can look for Kesich and find Mr. Alexander Kesich and his two brothers, Nick and George, who all enlisted. And it gives me the date of enlistment, their general occupation before they had enlisted. You know, were they a student? Were they a day laborer? What was their occupation? And their geographic region. So it'll kind of show me, yes, somebody with that name had served. And then I can go looking through the military records to see if I can find him. Their online catalog, just like any other type of online catalog, I can do a simple search and just search by keyword. So I can put in Monmouth, New Jersey and see what comes up, or I can be more specific. I could say that I'm looking for the 313th Engineers. And then once I'm in the catalog, I can limit my search by date, by location, by facility. So I just want to see records on the 313th Engineers that Kansas City might have, or College Park might have. And you would just narrow your search just like you would with any other type of search database. I did a search on Illinois Post because what I was really looking for were Army posts that were based in Illinois. So that would be something like Fort Sheridan or Camp Butler. So I just went into the catalog and I just did a search on Illinois Post. And it brings up 1,300 records for me. And as you can see, it breaks it down by category. Tells me that these are the images that are available online. These are the things that are web pages. It's not textual documents. It's going to take me to a page that deals with those records. Specific documents, images, and videos. But if you look along the left-hand side, here are those filters that I can use. I can filter by, I just want to see textual records. I can filter by, if I scroll down, by location. I just want to see records that are at the Great Lakes facility in Chicago, and I'd be able to narrow my search. One of the fun things that it pulled up, the second record, an Illinois hot weather victim. So this was, I'm going to show it to you. So this was a political cartoon that ran by the Associated Press. So it ran in a variety of different newspapers across the country, but it matched what I was looking for because it showed up in the Washington Post and it mentions Illinois. So these are the types of things that you're going to find in that collection. So again, I just did a simple keyword search, and from there I could limit or narrow my scope as I saw fit. So now what about museum and society archives? Those are equally important. So those are things that are going to deal with society. Those are going to be things that are the more human records, things like diaries, genealogies, letters, photographs, general correspondences. Those are going to be places where you're probably going to have a much larger ephemera collection. 3D objects, things like furniture and clothing, household items. Those are the types of things that museums and society archives typically contain. Every single ounce of that is relevant to you and your research. So if you have a story that great grandma always used this particular type of mixer or always, wore this particular style of dress, these museum and society archives would be able to provide you a copy or a picture of that. You'd be able to physically see that object to be able to tell that story. And it's just as equally a part of that family history and that family lore than a military record would be, or a probate or a birth certificate would be. So don't skip museums and societies in their archives, because they tell an important part of that story as well, because we are very visual human beings, and being able to see a copy of that object, even if it's not the one that great grandma owned, is still really important to be able to relate and put together in context why that object was important and why it was useful to the family. So museums and society archives have a lot of that. And while it's great to go to your local historical society, your local museum, because you're going to find things relevant specifically to your family, that could be things like newspapers, where they're going to be talking about everything that's happening in the community that day, not just birth, marriages, and deaths, but things like spelling bee awards and little Johnny fell off his horse and broke his leg. All of that is important to the contextual history of your family. But things like directories, business directories, city directories, church directories, farm directories would all be useful to narrow down and pinpoint your family in a particular place at a particular time. And there's nothing like a photograph. There's nothing like being able to see the similarities between yourself and that person in that particular photo. And historical societies, museums, archives are full of these types of images. Something that's really important, though, is when you contact, whether it's a historical society, a genealogical society, whether it's just a museum within that community, it's always important to ask about unidentifieds. And people have a tendency to think that I've lost my mind when I bring this up, but hear me out for a second. If you know what great grandpa Bob looked like, and you know he was a member of the VFW, they might have, VFW officers' photos, or they might have, VFW's annual picnic photos from the time period in which you know that great grandpa Bob was a member. He might not be identified in that photo, but you might be able to spot him. Things like class photos, where, you might have an 1893 one-room schoolhouse class photo, and maybe only one student, or maybe just the teacher, is identified and not the individual students. You're going to recognize your family member. So I always ask for those types of things. Don't just say, give me everything you have on the Middleton family, because you're going to miss out on these things where they took part in society. They didn't live in a vacuum. They worked and they went to school and they attended church, and they might have served in the military, or they might have been a fireman, or they might have worked in some other capacity in town. Make sure you're casting a wider net, and you're looking for all of those opportunities where you can find that visual image or that newspaper article that talks about them in relationship to the city and town in which they live. Great places to find that. Here in Chicago, the Chicago History Museum has an enormous photograph collection that is useful to me. Other places where you're going to find very relevant information: Daughters of the American Revolution, the Getty Institute. So if I'm looking for images of objects and things, Getty Institute has an amazing collection of things like that. The New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, their collections, their family genealogies and community records are outstanding. But then things like the Smithsonian. We have a tendency to think of national institutions as not having anything to do with my family or my community. It's absolutely 100% not true. So someplace like the Library of Congress, which is a public national library, has lots of individual records on individual people and communities and families. Smithsonian is no different. So going into the Smithsonian archives and just doing a search for the community, a particular person's name or surname, an object, a topic, a subject, to see what comes up, you might be surprised at what you find that might be relevant in your family history search. Religious archives, the exact same thing. For our church-going ancestors, religious archives are a great place to go to find information about their life within the church, not just their birth, marriage, and death, but did they pay a fee to attend? Did they rent their own pew? Were they somehow associated with the church as maybe a session member or a deacon or an elder in some regard? Are there meeting minutes where they're talking about individual members of that community? Things like church bulletins, those weekly bulletins you pick up when you walk into church on a Sunday morning. Those are the types of things that you're going to find in a religious archives, plus things like school records. So for those institutions that had a school associated with it, whether it's K through 12 or whether it's college, there's lots of colleges that were religious oriented, like Monmouth College. Pitt had a seminary school. So there's lots of different institutional type school records that would exist in religious archives as well. If your church is closed or if it is merged, the potential is there that those records might have been turned over to the regional or the national archive for that particular faith. So you want to start digging into and looking for these types of records as well. So for example, I give you this isn't complete by any means, but just some examples of places to look. Presbyterian Historical Society is based out of Philadelphia, American Baptist Archives, American Jewish Archives. The Catholic Archives is broken down into regional facilities, so Chicago Catholic Archdiocese records, Evangelical Lutheran Archives, that's based here in Illinois. So it's just an example of the types of things you can be looking for. Methodist churches are broken down into synods. So I would start probably on the synod level and see if the individual synod has an archive. And then if not, I would move up the food chain, so to speak, to the National United Methodist Church Archives to see what's out there. But then those religious universities as well, I would be looking in their seminary school records and things like that to see if they have anything on individual churches and parishioners as well. So religious archives have a very important role to play in doing your research. And if you have not reached out to a religious archive in your research, then you're definitely missing out on an opportunity there. So let's talk about state municipal archives. I really don't want to go down the rabbit hole here because in your area, you have so many amazing facilities in and around the New York area. But I do want to talk about the importance of using state municipal archives. So think of it as a bullseye. You're going to work out in concentric circles. So you're going to start on the local level to see if the city or the municipality has its own archives. Then I might move out to the township or the county level and see what types of records they have on the county level. From there, I'm going to move out to the state to see what does the state have on that particular community, that municipality, or that township or county as well. And I'm going to slowly expand that circle. And then I'll look federally because, like I said, the federal repositories are responsible for a handful of states that collect records that are pertinent to federal things. So, but that would include the census and bankruptcies and things like that. But they might mention individual municipalities in those collections. So don't overlook those. Probate court files, civil and criminal cases, family court, chancery court, which is equity court. You have an argument with your neighbor over a fence line. That shows up in chancery court, civil court more than criminal court. They're not creating, it's not a criminal offense. So there's different layers to the court system that you want to be aware of as well to figure out exactly who would be responsible for those records and how would you get access to them. Things like election results, voter registration records, candidates list, ballot initiatives, all of those are going to be on the state municipal level. So if your particular town was having a ballot initiative that keeps coming up year after year after year, whether that's supporting local police and fire, whether that's expansion of services to seniors or veterans, those things that show up, you definitely want to be looking for sample ballots, and the state and municipal archives should have those. Things like land records, deeds, mortgages, transfers, trust deeds, all of those are going to be on the state or municipal level. Those military records I talked about, the provost marshal is responsible, kind of like the Radar O'Reilly, overseeing disbursement and procurement. But each unit if it was a localized unit, if it was a state militia, or if it was a state unit or the state National Guard, those records would be on the state level. So you would be looking for those records through the state archives. Things like taxes. So how many levels do you get taxed on? You get taxed on the city level, the county level, the state level, the federal level. All of those are different levels in which you can contact those institutions to see if they have copies of tax records for your area. Obviously, vital records, birth, marriages, and deaths are an important part of that too. So state municipal archives are really, really important. And you are at a huge advantage on the East Coast at the fact that you have city historians or county historians. In Illinois, we do not have that. I cannot reach out to, the historian for a particular area and look for that information. I have to reach out to the government institutions directly. So you're at a huge advantage where you are that you have access to such a resource. But again, you have some fantastic collections. You've got the New York State Archives, which has records. The New York Public Library, I talked about their digital collections earlier. You've got the link here for you that relates to that. Oh my goodness, the New York City Municipal Archives is absolutely amazing. I'll explain that in just a second. But things like the New Jersey State Archives, using their digital databases that they already have. I'm going to kind of show an example of that in a second. You probably have never heard of the Power Library, but Pennsylvania has a digital collection of e-resources already available. So this is separate from the state archives. This is separate from the Pennsylvania Historical Society, which has an amazing database of land records from pre-Revolutionary War all the way up into the 18th century. But in your handout, if you're looking outside of your region, you just want to know, what is out there for Nebraska? What is out there for South Carolina? What is out there for Illinois or Indiana? I have that link in here for you if you wanted to take a look at other archive collections in digital collections. So I'm absolutely in love with the New York City Municipal Collection. Their photographs, their land records collections are absolutely stunning and amazing. And I use this as a resource all of the time to help people put things into context, to help put a place with an image with a location. So if you have addresses, you can go into this database and look at what the street looked like, look at what the building looked like. Most of these are 1930s, 40s, 50s images that you could take a look at. Some of them go back a little bit further. But I am a huge Dodgers fan. One thing about me is my family and I are trying to visit all 30 National League or MLB ballparks. We've visited 24 out of 30, but my absolute favorite is Dodger Stadium. I'm a huge Dodgers fan. So what I absolutely loved and geeked out over was that I could go into the Municipal Archives collection and see the blueprints for Ebbets Field. Absolutely geeked out over being able to see the original blueprints for this. So some really cool things that show up in this collection. It's not just all photographs. There's things like bridge constructions and subway tunnels and all kinds of plans and maps and things besides just looking at historic buildings and house images. So there's a lot of things in here. I'm sure you've all already used this before for various reasons, but it's one of my favorites. And even being so far away, it's something that I use pretty regularly. Other things like New Jersey, I kind of touched on New Jersey State Archives, they're searchable databases. I do a lot of Presbyterian research, a lot of Covenanter history. So I use early colonial New Jersey records pretty frequently from about 1680 to about 1750. And this collection is absolutely outstanding. Even if you don't have family that goes back that far, their collections are still really, really useful to you, especially if you had people that came from Scotland to the Eastern Seaboard sometime between, like I said, 1680 and 1750. I would search this collection because even if they didn't stay in New Jersey, they most likely landed in New Jersey or in Philadelphia because a lot of them fled because of religious persecution. So going into this collection and looking to see if they show up in these early New Jersey records before they might have gone to New York or New York City. A lot of my people went from Aberdeen or from Monmouth up north into New York in subsequent generations. But I find a lot of them that show up in these records collections. So, if you haven't played around with it, it's worth going in and using. And probably the one that I get the most bang for my buck is the early New Jersey land records. So whether it's Witherspoons, whether it's Johnstones, whoever it happens to be, going in here sheds a lot of insight into my Presbyterian and my Scottish ancestors, because they show up in a lot of these really early records. And it's a fantastic collection too. Like they say, it's one of the most unique sets of records. And it's true. They really do have really responsive collection. So I went in and I did a search on Johnstone. William Johnstone was one of those who came with his sons. And I can go in and do a search and it shows me all of the records results. But what's even cooler about it is the fact that I can click on it and view a PDF version of that record. So this is a land transaction that's being transferred between James Johnstone in 1685. And I know this is incredibly hard to read, but it tells me, gives me a little bit about the land and the purchase that's taking place. And it tells me that, the land is being transferred in March of 1865 and to the parties involved. So you can see the land is being transferred over to a Mr. Boyd. These are just amazing records collections that you have access to. So I kind of talked a little bit about the New York Public Library's collection and how it's searchable in DPLA. But let's say I wanted to know more about that land transfer. Let's say I wanted to be able to visually see where this was. I can pull up that transaction that shows up in those early New Jersey records and then go into the New York Public Library's digital collections, specifically their digital atlas collection, which has over 7,000 atlases in it. And I can pull up the atlases from Monmouth County in New Jersey, and I can take a look at and figure out precisely where this particular piece of land was. So you're always using these together. And just because one shows up in a record in New Jersey doesn't mean that I can't use a New York database or research collection in order to find out more. So I love the fact that you can pull from, the area there to learn more. New York State Archives also has a really amazing collection of pathfinders. Pathfinders are just finding aids, like I said. So if I want to know more about probate records for my family in Albany or in Schenectady, I can go and read this Pathfinder, and it gives me links to other resources and other collections and gives me more information about what that particular county collects and what types of records are available and how can I access them. Like I said, you always want to know the scope of the collection, but you also want to know how can I access it and what can I do? So this one on the right is from the New York State Library, and it tells me that because of the handling involved in photocopies, they have to be done with the approval of a library staff member. Okay, that's fantastic. Here's the types of microfilm we have. Here's what you need to do if you want to do on-site research. They're not going to do genealogical research for you, but they will help you along the way. So looking at these sites and digging into and finding out, just because they might not have a searchable database of the records you need, doesn't mean that the information that they have isn't useful and relevant. You want to make sure that you're digging into these finding aids in these pathfinders so that you understand what exists before you reach out to them to visit. So unfortunately, I don't have the ability to take any questions from you, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of the types and the places where you can go to dig in and learn more about your family by using archives and facilities.